the reason cops pull you over and ask you for license and registration, right, is to identify your nationality. And if they ask you this also, right, because this is the most important part, um, and they ask you, right, they ask you before they ask you any of that, right, they ask you this. They say, they say, do you have insurance on your vehicle? Why are they asking me if I have insurance on my vehicle? Well, the reason they're asking you if you have insurance on your vehicle is because they want to know whether or not they can violate you in that second. It's kind of like, right, if you have a bunch of people who live in the community and they don't have insurance, this means the property value won't go up. You know what I mean? Like you're not insured, you know. So if you're driving, right, and you have a passport, you know, they're going to use that to identify you. They're going to see like, okay, this person, he has federal protection. Federal protection, right? This person has a passport. You just give them your booklet, right? But they still want to know, do you have a license to operate on the road? Because ideally, right, they don't want to see if you have a passport. They really don't want to see that, right? Because that has more federal jurisprudence than you say just a little driver's license, right? That you got at a state, a secretary of state. You know what I mean? So if they ask you, do you have insurance? And a lot of times they will, right? Depending on what type of community you live in. If you live in a bad community, they're going to ask you if you have insurance, because this is going to let them know, like, okay, if this person doesn't have insurance and they're on the road and I violate them, my bond's not going to get charged. My bond is not going to go up, and you say, well, you don't argue with them at that point, right? Because, most of these cops, right, some know this and some don't. But you take a cop that, like, who comes from like a neighboring suburb or a neighboring county, you know what I mean? And I've said this in the past, it's above reproach when you see people who come from other counties into your county and get civic jobs, being an officer of a police force, being an agent of a law enforcement force. When you see things like that, right? Like this person, they're coming to your community and they're from like 2 counties over and they're talking about they're going to represent you in, the state capitol. Like at that point, like you got to really wonder, like, what are their motives, right? And this is how I kind of look at, when I see a person like Alyssa Slockoff, or Gary Peters, you know what I mean? Like for the state of Michigan, right? These are people who are not from, the particular counties that surround Detroit, right? They're not from those counties. Macomb, Wayne, Oakland, they're not from those counties. But they represent the people there, right? So this is where you get nepotism, So like when you look at the fact that a person can just come into your community and have order to ask you if you have insurance, you got to remember this is coming from the higher ups. This is coming from the mayor and the governor. This is coming from your district council. If they're asking you if you have insurance and you don't have insurance, this cop is liable to take your life. And his bond is, they're not even going to transfer him off the force, This is why I don't prefer to move to states where you have to have insurance. This means your city don't have insurance on you. Like, think about that, right? Your city don't have insurance on you. Like, if you look at Detroit after all these years, there's houses that's been sitting in one area vacant and blight since like 2003. you know, and it slowly just fell apart, fell apart, fell apart. The city hasn't come out and tore it down, nothing. So when the city says, I'm running on insurance, not running on assurance, I'm running on insurance. They always run on assurance. They never run on insurance. They always tell you what they're going to do, how it's going to be better, and it never gets better. It never gets better. You got to remember, though, if they're honest about solving blight, solving police terrorism, you know, solving budget misappropriation, solving voter suppression, like you don't know UFOs exist, solving, archival record, all of that, right? Solving all of that. When they don't do those things, you have to understand something. The best way to get, out of that situation is to not only leave the county, but when you go to another county, you make sure that you buy liquidation in that particular state's bond sector. You know what I mean? Like buy their water bonds, buy their municipal bonds, buy their fire bonds. You know what I mean? That's going to force, a city like, take Detroit, for example. They will have to, raise the premium on their particular budgeters. They will have to raise the premium on their senators. So, if, the city goes bankrupt again, then that's a more chance where you can hold them liable to not doing what they're supposed to do, You see what I mean? So, great peace, Yakoki.